Hi there, I'm Vicky. I'm glad you're here. Today I'm going to be making some ATC cards. So I know that sounds strange because ATC stands for Artist Trading Cards. So Artist Trading cards are what I'm making. I'm going to be doing some mushrooms. I love illustrating mushrooms. This is a lino cut that I've made. And these are the mushrooms that came out. I just thought, I've got to do some more of these. They're a lot of fun. I like drawing mushrooms. Anyone can draw mushrooms. They're very easy. So I'm going to take you through a step-by-step approach. First, sketching out your mushrooms on 3 ATC cards. And the reference material I'm using comes from this wonderful book, Amazing Things, Extraordinary Things to Cut Out in Collage. And I found some lovely photographs of mushrooms in here. They've got quite a vintage feel. There's 2 whole pages. And mushrooms come in many, many varieties, as you probably know. But I love the fact that I've got so many to choose from. So I'm going to choose 3 that I really like. I'm going to illustrate them in pen. And then I am going to watercolour them using my Winsor Newton Professional Watercolors and a very limited colour palette. So I was looking through this and I could see yellow ochre, burnt sienna, raw sienna, a bit of permanent sap green, and maybe a little bit of black. Look at this one here. This is so fun. This is a collage that's been created using that very large mushroom in the centre of the page. And I'm actually doing a review on this book because I love it so much. So look out for this book review coming in a few weeks' time on my channel. It's already scheduled in. So let's get into the ATC cards. And I'm going to call them ATC cards because they are actual greeting cards that we're going to put together with artist trading cards. So I can get 3 out of this piece of scrap. And this is why I like creating in this size. It's 2.5 by 3.5 inches. And I also found these Strathmore frame cards, which will fit ATCs exactly. They have a really pretty envelope. It has like a beautiful deckled edge, and you can open them and slide your ATC into the back like this. There's a little opening and it's a lovely snug fit, so you don't need to adhere your cards. I'm going to be using an Archer's size 10 round brush, and this was a complimentary brush that I received when I bought some Archer's paper or Arch paper. And I've got a pencil and some scissors and a ruler just to cut these little cards down. And I'm going to use the template that I've made to cut. Here's my little field box, my Winsor Newton Professional Watercolors. There's my little colour palette. I'm only going to use the colours in the top half of that palette. So the first thing to do is to make the cards simple enough. You're just cutting 3 rectangles to 2.5 by 3.5 inches. And you can see that paper has a lot of overspray from the work that I cut that down from. I'm going to go with it and use that as part of the background. So I'm going to have this little guy as my first illustration, this smaller red-topped mushroom. I don't know the names of the mushrooms. If you know the names, let me know, but they just look amazing. I'm going to go in without any pencil drawing. I love illustration work and I'm quite confident in my pen strokes, and I feel that it gives a looser drawing than if I was to sketch it in pencil. But if you would prefer to sketch in pencil and you feel more comfortable that way, please do so. Then you can always go over it with ink. I'm using a fine liner Sharpie. It's a very inexpensive black pen. I've got lots of these and they work really well because they are waterproof. But you could use a micron pen or any kind of waterproof marker. If you're not sure, then just grab a tiny piece of paper or even on the back of the paper, draw your lines, let it dry for a minute and then try washing clear water over it. And if it doesn't bleed out, you know you have a waterproof pen. These little lines here I'm just flicking very, very lightly because they're soft, fine lines. I'm going to add a few little bits of grass and just sketchy little bits of flowers so that my mushroom isn't floating. And that's pretty much the sketch done for the first one. Now, the next one I like is this fellow here. This is really interesting. This is 3 little mushrooms together. It's a really flat-topped mushroom. I love the look of it. I love this little hat on the top of the mushroom. It's very different and fun. So I'm just sketching those lines in, and I'm breaking the lines from time to time so that they're not a consistent line, but there's little breaks in them, making sure I get in the details of that little sort of collar under the mushroom at the top. I really love. And I think that these other mushrooms are going to be really, really lovely. Yeah, so let's try these 3 together. They have quite a bit of detail in them, and I'm going to put that in with a pen. So I'm adding these little tiny little dots down the edges of the stem. And again, I'm just going to put some grounding in, just a little bit of ground underneath. Taking those dashes up the taller stem. So mushrooms are easy. Anyone can draw them. You can't really get them wrong because they do come in weird kind of wonky shapes. So if your drawing is a bit weird and wonky, well, that's perfect for mushrooms. A few little dabs on the top for the spots, just a suggestion of those little lumpy bumps on the top, rather than trying to draw this in a realistic fashion. I'm drawing it in an illustrative sketch fashion. I love the colour of these 2 mushrooms here, and they have sort of like a little pleated cap on the top, which is different to the others. And I love this sort of, it looks almost like a beard at the base where they connect with the earth. I really like that part too. That gave me the opportunity to draw a lot of little interesting lines. Curving it down, this is probably the easiest of the 3 to draw because it has the least details in it. But I'm still adding some lines where I think there may be some shading. Definitely put some shading under the caps at the top of the stem, maybe at the sides of the stems. Just imagine there is a light source, and it's fairly easy to see the light source from the illustration here. And just go with it and be confident. And again, I'm going to sketch in a little bit of ground at the bottom so that it's grounded, and maybe put a little bit of sketchy grasses. I'm aiming to have a different kind of grass in each of these 3 cards, so they will look a little bit different. Now, the colours I've chosen to work with are yellow ochre, burnt sienna, ivory black, permanent sap green and raw sienna, and a little bit of Winsor red, because we do have that red cap mushroom there, which is absolutely gorgeous. And what I aim to do with these mushrooms, you can see these little bumps that I'm putting in on the top here. They are bumpy, so don't put in circles, just put in little kind of, I guess they're a curved line going from the top of the mushroom coming down rather than an actual circle, just sort of little bumps. And then I'm adding a bit of shading under the cap where there'll be some shade, and working on that frill. But these were a lot of fun to put together. What I aim on doing with my colour palette is using a little bit of each colour in all 3 cards so that they will look consistent. I'm bringing in my Ranger water spray and activating my paints. I had to leave that sit for a minute because I should have done this before I started the video. So I let them sit and let them get a bit wet, because they do take a minute or 2 for the paint to start absorbing into the half pans. So I'm starting off with yellow ochre, and that's going to be a quick wash. This is going to be fairly loose, but I am aiming to work with the main image rather than doing too much background work to start with. I can do some splashes at the end and add more later. For now, I'm focusing on those little mushrooms and on the ground as well. So I'm bringing in some permanent sap green, and I'm adding a little bit of alizarin crimson into that just to knock it back, because I don't generally use sap green straight out of the pan. I like to knock it back with a bit of a darker colour. And that's just a rough line across the bottom from side to side. And while I've got some on my brush, I am going to add a few splatters into the background. Now I'm coming in with some raw sienna. Raw sienna and yellow ochre are very similar colours, and they are the perfect colour match for this mushroom, which is sort of an orangey, yellowy colour. Now you can see the amount of water I have on my brush there. It's not too wet. I am working wet on dry, so the paper itself is completely dry. I haven't pre-wet it. And this helps when you're trying to do a more detailed painting. You don't want too much water or colours will start bleeding, and then it becomes much more difficult to control. I have two water jars there. I tend to have a dirty water jar and a clean water jar. Some artists prefer to have a warm colour jar and a cool colour jar. I like the clean water to be available for me so that if I'm putting some paint down, I know that my brush is clean. But it's really up to you which method you use. Just bringing in some more detail and setting that aside to dry. And what I'm planning on doing is working on all three ATCs at once, which gives each one a chance to dry while I'm waiting on the next layer. So with watercolours, you do have to be a little bit patient. You have to allow each layer to dry before reworking it. Otherwise, you tend to lose that sense of colours deepening and becoming more of a glaze, which is another layer over the top, or partial layer, where you allow some of that first layer to show through. And you can see this is quite a quick little sketch. I'm not overworking it. I'm not putting too much time into details. Often with these small ATC watercolours, if you can be fast with your strokes and let things dry and come back to them, you'll get a much nicer finish than if you fiddle with it and dab at it and keep adding while layers are wet. It also really helps to get up and walk away from your work. Now this is the one I'm going in for next, which is the little red cap. So if I'm finished or waiting for something to dry, I will often stand up, walk around the room, maybe make a cup of tea, come back and have another look at it. Because if you're up close and working with these layers and the layers are drying much lighter, often you lose your focus of what it is you're trying to achieve. So just stand up and walk away from your work, come back, and you'll see immediately, oh, well, that area needs darkening, or that area needs to be a little lighter, or I don't need any more work in that area because that's done, or I've reached the level of colour that I'm happy with. Now I'm using this trick of bringing in a Q-tip while the paint is still very wet and pulling out the red paint to create the white dots. Now you have to work fast with this because once it's dry you can't use this technique at all. And I used several different Q-tips, or cotton buds as we call them in Australia, to make the effect of lifting out some of that red. And you can see I'm working quite fast. I think a light, fast hand with these works quite well. I'm not trying to be too accurate. I want it to have a very free and loose feel. Some more of that sap green, which I put in straight from my pan, and now I'm adding some burnt sienna to it to knock it back by dropping some pigment into that wet paint. So there are different ways to create the grass, and I'm trying with each of these to create different sorts of effects. You can see I'm flicking, and this brush is damp but not wet, so I'm able to get quite fine lines with this. Very, very light touch is what you need to succeed with this. And if you're not sure, you can always practice on a piece of scrap first before you try it on your card. Now I'm going to try grasses, but all different sorts. So this next sort of grass, I am not flicking quite so much. I'm actually adding little spots of green in, and I'm going to attach some lines to these with my pen once it's all dry. And this one, you can see again, I'm creating something different on the side. I want each of the grasses with these to be slightly a different effect. Now I'm just darkening up some of the red, and I'm stippling, which is just tap, tap, tap with the brush all around. This gives a really pretty blend with your colours. And it will always look different once it's dry, so it will look less patchy and smoother when it's dry than when you're actually painting it. So remember that that's a factor with watercolour. It's also the fun part of watercolour, is that it has its own way of decorating or illustrating your works, because it's not like putting it down with pencil or acrylic or something where you can see what's happening. You have to wait for it to dry, so that drying time is exciting. You can see how I've taken that red and brought it into all three ATCs, because I want the colours in all of the cards. Even though those mushrooms did not seem to have any actual red in them in the pieces that I was using for my inspiration, but I want my cards to feel as though they are part of a set. And I want quite a bit of red in the background of this little red cap, because red is a bossy colour, it tends to take over. So just to have a red cap and no more red around that piece would not have looked quite so harmonious as letting some of the red splatter into the background. So that's helping to make it a very even and interesting piece. Now I'm building up some more browns here, some deeper browns, and for that I was using burnt sienna and ivory black, or you could use burnt sienna and put some sap green into it. It would be a slightly lighter brown, but I wanted the dark tones now to make some dark brown shadows, dropping that pigment in where I need to for shadows on the bases of the others. And you can see how I go back and forth between one ATC and the other, just to help with the drying time, that while one area is drying on one ATC, I can work with the next. Now you may find this a little too confusing and just prefer to work on one at a time, but I love the fact that I can spread this colour scheme around all three while the paint is still on my brush. Just work from one to the other, and it's fun. I really had fun creating these three pieces. They're very light-hearted little works of art. They're nothing too serious, but they're interesting because mushrooms do have fascinating form. I really enjoyed doing the lino cut mushrooms that I showed you at the beginning of the video. There was so much variation within the field of mushrooms. I think I had 3 different mushroom varieties in my composition. So now I'm doing 3 mushrooms on my ATC cards and loving it. I think they're very cute little subject matter. And anybody can do this. So I'm bringing in my heat tool because it is all quite wet. And now I have some Winsor Newton designer gouache. I only have the white gouache because I figure I can make any colour I want with the white. So I haven't rushed out to buy a whole lot of tubes. I don't need to. I can add colour to this if I want to create an opaque feel. Now this is for just sharpening those whites in the mushroom cap. And I'm also going to use a little bit of white gouache if I've lost any of my highlights, which can sometimes happen when you're putting layer upon layer upon layer of paint onto your piece. I'm actually going to add this to add some highlight into the stems. And I'm only using a small amount. But it just lifts any bits that may have gone a little too dark and brings those highlights back. With watercolour, for your work to be successful, you need different gradients of tones. So you need your lowlights, your highlights, and your mid-tones. And what can make some watercolours look very flat is if everything is in your mid-tone range without the lowlights and the highlights to accent various shadows and lights that appear in nature. And once you get this, once you understand that you need to create the highlights, lowlights and midtones, your work will really begin to show a lot of improvement. Now you can see I'm bringing in that Sharpie ultra fine point and enhancing those grasses. So I'm adding a few little bits of stems and really sharpening up that grass at the base of each of the mushrooms. Now I'm going to bring in some background because, to be perfectly honest, this big tall mushroom in the centre began to bleed out from the stem. So I thought, right, I need to do something to fix that. So I've put in a little bit of a background wash, which the other two don't have, but that did actually soften that mistake that I made. Because the paint had dried, I'd hit it with the heat gun, and once your paint is dry, you really can't lift it. You can do quite a bit of lifting if you make an error by getting a thirsty brush, which means you clean your brush in pure water, squeeze out all the water onto a paper towel, really squeeze the bristles with your fingers too. I find if you squeeze the bristles together, you can get a really thirsty brush, and put it straight into the wet paint, and it should pick up almost everything as long as the paint is still wet. So you can fix those little issues, but I hadn't actually noticed that that was bleeding because I was working on 3 at once. So here's my colour scheme, mainly from the top with a little bit of that Winsor red coming in for the red cap. And I find if you have a limited colour scheme, maybe use a little bit of white gouache. That's all you need. You really do not need a lot of paints when you begin watercolouring. You need a red, a blue, a yellow, and go from there. Now you can see I'm putting my signature on the left-hand side. Normally I sign on the right, but I hadn't left enough room, so I'm signing on the left. And there is an up and a down way to put these into the cards, so make sure that your card's going to open in the right direction. It's a lovely snug fit, and you need to just work that into each of the edges so that no edges are sticking out, but it will hold quite securely without any glue, which is great because you can take them in and out, you can change them around. And you can see the difference having a frame makes. It really elevates your work by putting it in a frame, and this is exactly what these cards do. And you can see me just manipulating that edge. You really need to tuck it under that edge so it's not sticking out, and then it's perfectly secure. Look how pretty that deckled edge is on the envelope. These Strathmore cards are readily available. They've been around for a very long time. I have these in various sizes because I think they're a great way to showcase your art. Just popping that in. You can see how that looks really very finished. I did bend that card a little bit when I was putting it in, so just be careful you don't do what I did and go at it a little bit too hard and leave a bended mark there. That kind of spoiled that one a little bit. But you can see there's this little pockets that you could put your ATCs in if you wanted to protect them going through the mail, I guess, in case you didn't want them to get wet. I didn't use that. I don't think it's necessary, but it's handy to have it. It comes with the pack of cards. And there they are, the Strathmore Artist Cards. And here are the finished pieces. You can see how each of those grasses has a different kind of grass in it, just to make some changes with the understory there. I hope you enjoyed that today. I'll catch you again next time. Bye for now.